Welcome back to The Whole Picture. Are you stuck in the dark when it comes to taking pictures in low-light situations, especially when you can't use a flash? Well, so is my student, David Mullinax. So I'm meeting him at a friend's band rehearsal tonight to teach him how to take great-looking photographs in less than perfect light. Hey, guys, how you doing? David.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming down here tonight. You ready to take some good photographs?
Oh, most certainly.
Okay. Well, first, let's take a look at the photograph you took last week that you emailed me earlier today.
Okay.
Now, this is your low-light photo, right? Mm-hmm. Do you like it?
Not at all.
Well, it's a little blurry.
Yeah.
And that's really a classic example of what happens when you're shooting in low light like this with no flash.
Okay.
But don't worry. I'm going to teach you some things tonight that will help you take a better low-light photograph.
Okay, great.
All right?
Can't wait to get started.
Okay. Well, the first thing we're going to learn about is how to change your camera's sensor sensitivity to the light.
Okay.
And we do that by adjusting your ISO setting.
Okay.
Ever heard of ISO?
I've seen it, but I don't know what it means.
Okay. Well, you know, in your film camera, you can buy films at different speeds, right? 100, 200, 400 ASA or ISO. Mm-hmm. It means the same thing, film speed. With a digital camera, ISO is basically the camera's sensor's sensitivity to the light.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the ISO setting. So when you raise your ISO setting, you're going to let more light into the camera, which is great when you're shooting in low light situations like this with no flash.
Right.
Okay, so a lot of cameras have different ISO settings on them, 50, 200, 400, on up sometimes. Mm-hmm. So that will let more light into your camera when you raise the ISO setting, but it does come at a price.
Oh, goodness.
There's a little side effect called noise.
What's noise?
What's noise?
Yeah.
Noise is very similar to the grain that you might see in a traditional film photograph. Okay? But we're not going to worry about that just yet. Let's just go ahead and play with the ISO settings on your camera and take some shots and have some fun.
All right.
When shooting in low light, you have a better chance of producing a good photograph by taking full manual control of your camera and telling it to do things it wouldn't normally do in the automatic mode. Changing the ISO is one way to do this. In most digital cameras, the ISO is adjusted by going to the ISO selection in your menu system. In low-light situations, you would choose a higher ISO to increase the camera's sensitivity. The image sensor is where your camera converts what comes into the lens into digital information. Think of the image sensor like the film in a film camera. What's great about digital cameras is they enable you to change ISO settings quickly to adapt to changing light conditions or to respond to different shooting situations. One of the advantages of digital cameras over film is that you can change the ISO settings from image to image. But remember the downside. The higher the ISO, the more potential for noise in your photos. Noise describes a picture that looks grainy, and it becomes most visibly apparent in the shadow areas, where instead of seeing solid black or the shadow detail, you see big blocks of color or random colored pixels. This gives the photograph a muddy, pixelated look. Unfortunately, it's not a perfect world. If you want to shoot in low light without a flash, raising the ISO is necessary, and getting around the noise is hard to do. Some digital cameras come with built-in noise reduction features, so the camera tries to automatically compensate for the noise created at a higher ISO. But if your camera doesn't have this feature, you can always work with the pictures on your computer once you get them back home. Okay, the other two settings to consider here are shutter speed and aperture.
Okay.
Now, most digital cameras will give you a choice between shutter priority mode and aperture priority mode.
What's the difference between the two?
Good question, I'll show you. Right here on this dial, we'll turn it to S for shutter priority mode, and that means you can select whatever shutter speed you want for fast or slower shutter, depending on the effect that you want.
Okay.
And then the camera will compensate for that and provide the proper aperture or lens opening for the right exposure.
Okay.
Now for aperture priority, the exact opposite is true. I'll switch it to A for aperture priority. Now you can select whatever aperture you want or lens opening for more or less depth of field, and then the camera will compensate for this with the proper shutter speed to give you the right exposure.
Okay.
Sounds pretty easy, right?
Pretty easy, yeah.
Okay. Just remember, the wider your lens opening is, that's a lower f-stop number on your camera. And the camera will then adjust the shutter speed to be faster to provide for proper exposure.
Okay.
So in this lighting situation, low light, I would suggest using a faster shutter speed.
Why's that?
Well, because most bands, like these guys, are going to move around a lot, right, when they perform. So if you're shooting at a slower shutter speed, that movement is going to cause blur in the picture.
Right.
Just like in your picture you brought in earlier today.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's why you want to use a faster shutter speed in this situation.
Okay.
So I would just say play around. Go between shutter priority mode and aperture priority mode. Play around, take a lot of pictures, and see what works best for you.
Alrighty.
To help make your photos look more professional, you need to understand how to take control of your camera's shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed is the length of time the window in your camera's lens stays open to let light in. And aperture describes the size of the window when it lets that light in, which is measured in f-stops. In order to take photos that are properly exposed, it takes the right combination between shutter speed and aperture. But in low light settings, it's important to take control over the aperture and let as much light into the camera so that your camera can use the fastest shutter speed possible. The aperture also controls your depth of field. The larger the lens opening, the shallower your depth of field. The smaller the lens opening, the greater the depth of field. Professional photographers use depth of field as one of the elements in composing their images. Like in this case, it's okay to throw your background out of focus and lose some of your depth of field so that your picture isolates the performers from the background. To take manual control of your aperture and let the camera control the shutter, you need to set the camera into aperture priority mode and then manually adjust the aperture to your desired size. These settings vary, so check your owner's manual for your specific camera. Another consideration is how to steady your camera for each of these shots. Some shooting situations, like this one in a club, are not conducive for bringing along a tripod. So here are some tricks to make your camera steady. Try balancing your elbows on a hard surface, or find a railing or table to rest your camera on. Once you begin to look for other options besides a tripod, you'll find ways to make your camera steady. For more information on aperture priority mode or shooting in low-light situations, log on to our website at DIYnetwork.com. While you're there, check out some of the other photos that we shot today. Now that your camera settings are in place, it's time to balance things out. Up next, I'll teach you how to manually set your camera's white balance.